continuing with our last train of thought, we explained in the last clip on a mystical level how we can change our desires. It starts with manipulating the things that give us pleasure. Let's talk about that today on a very theoretical level, but in a more practical sense. In other words, let's look at it from a psychological aspect. What has psychology today taught us how we can change those associations? What's amazing is that the Bali Musar thought of this long before psychoanalysis, right? Rabbi Salanter lived in 1810. Freud, Leonard Lahavdil, didn't come around till 1856. So the concept that our behaviors is rooted in our emotions, in our desires, is a Torah idea, and we can learn from psychology how to put that into very practical use for ourselves, how we can manipulate our emotional world so that we can get behaviors that are good for us, that are healthy for us, instead of the behaviors that are bad for us. And here's the idea. Scientists used to believe that the brain doesn't change. As a child, of course, it develops, but once an adult, once a person achieves adult level, so the brain doesn't change much or really at all. What scientists know today is that that's not true. The brain is constantly in flux, laying down new nerve centers and making new connections. Because actually, what they're discovering is the way the brain works. Most of the brain is a subconscious part of the brain that regulates, runs our entire life. The way it works is that there's I think 100 billion of these neurons. These look at it like electrical lights or sparks that are disconnected. But connections are formed. This thought causes that thought, which lights up, which sends messages down the neurological system, telling the body what to do, until eventually the brain starts to take shape, and you actually form a mind and a personality. For example, as a little child, mommy comes in, and mommy gives the baby food. So eventually, the baby learns to say, oh, that person is associated with nourishment. Oh, okay, and now those links are fired up together, and it creates associations, and the brain that was created up of all these different lights now is forming into a specific mind. The way these pathways are formed, these associations are made, there's actually two ways. The first way is simply repetition. When we do the same thing again and again, so the associations formed between that action and whatever it caused gets deeper and deeper and thicker and stronger until the mind just learns how to do it subconsciously. For example, you drive home from work. So the first time you drive home, you're not sure, you're looking at the signs, okay, follow, make the second right. You do it a few times, then you don't have to think about it anymore. You do it a lot of times, you do it all year, you could think about something else, and suddenly you're home. Your subconscious mind has learned how to do it all by itself. It's like walking through the woods. The first time you walk through the woods, there's no path there, but you walk through 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. Eventually, just because you're walking through again and again, there's a trail, there's a pathway. That's exactly how the mind forms the circuitry and these associations until the mind gets a certain character. Besides for repetition, there's another very, very powerful way that these associative links are formed and the brain actually takes shape. And that's pleasure. The brain craves pleasure. And there's actually something what they call is the reward center. And what happens is when a person engages in healthy behavior, like you eat good food or you do a hard workout, so serotonins are released. There's it activates, it triggers this reward center in the brain, this very, very powerful feel-good drug. And when the brain experiences that, so it says, oh, that action releases these serotonins, which makes me feel so good. Oh, so that action's a good thing to do. And then when a person experiences pain, you touch fire once, so then, ouch, so, oh my gosh, that experience is associated now with pain, don't do that again. So pain and pleasure are very, very powerful forces that actually shape the brain. And the really cool thing is that there's limited resources up in the mind. Okay? There's only a certain amount of neurons and energy that create those connections. So when you choose to develop and focus on certain connections, the other ones that you're not utilizing wither away, they atrophy and die. Basically, use it or lose it. So the more focus we have on creating specific kinds of connections, we can affect how our mind is actually going to be shaped. And scientists actually could see the brain changing shape based on the connections and associations that are happening in it. Now, the way this is used in therapy with addicts is, let's look at addiction and how that works for a minute. So we mentioned earlier that when a person engages in healthy behaviors, so that triggers reward centers in the brain. For example, exercise or whatever, right? What happens when a user finds some kind of drug? So what happens is the drug kind of tricks the brain and activates the reward center, even though nothing healthy happens. Actually, maybe something unhealthy happened. Okay, so a person is smoking or injecting something in themselves, not good for them, but that triggers the reward center. What happens is the brain makes an association between that drug and that pleasure until the person feels like that is a wonderful thing. And it becomes hardwired into the brain, which is why it's so hard to stop. Once a person becomes an addict, it's much deeper than their conscious mind and their conscious will. It gets hardwired into the brain, this is a very powerful association, that this is a good thing. And what makes it even worse is that natural pleasures have a certain shut-off point, a certain satiation point. The natural pleasures of life, so we enjoy them, the pleasure center is triggered, but at a certain point there's a satiation. But when a person is using these kind of drugs, since it circumvents the whole natural system, it just triggers that pleasure again and again, and just boom, 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 and the brain just goes crazy, craving this thing more and more. Well, in hypnotherapy, there's many different systems of therapy, how to work with addicts. In hypnotherapy, the way it works is we help the client create positive associations to positive behaviors and painful negative associations to the drugs. I'll just give you an example of how this works with smoking. One person told me this is how he stopped smoking. He walks into the therapist's office, and the therapist says, I want you to think of something that makes you regurgitate, something makes you throw up, something that disgusts you so bad, so horribly, that you throw up. And what this person said is, well, when he sees throw up on the floor, it's so disgusting, so violent, it just causes him to... He's okay, great, I want you to think about that and really get disgusted and conjure up that feeling of disgust inside you. And while you're feeling that, I want you to think of a cigarette. And what the therapist was doing was creating a link, an associative link. And actually, the next time the person thought of a cigarette, they got very disgusted. Okay? So there's a way that we can manipulate these associations to achieve the behaviors that we want and stop doing the behaviors that we don't want. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing and how we can utilize this wisdom in the Mechemes HaYetzer. We explained that we have learned to associate pleasure with sin the same way. It's almost exactly the same as an addict learns to associate pleasure with the drug when there's really nothing good there. So we have learned to associate pleasure with Averos because of the spirituality that's trapped in it. But the same way that hypnotherapy works with an addict, we can do this kind of therapy on ourselves with fighting the Yetzer Hara. What if we can realign and experience the pain of regret that is really associated with every Avera, so that we won't enjoy that anymore. And then we actually allow ourselves to simply experience viscerally the pleasure that comes from doing mitzvahs. And what's different about this than what you already knew is that we're not talking about thinking about these things. You already know in your mind that good is pleasurable and bad. What we're talking about here is doing it in a therapeutic kind of way. Actually sitting with the sensation of pain from Averos and pleasure from mitzvahs. And this is the crux of where change is going to happen. So we're going to be describing in our next share exactly what this looks like. But send your email to thetorahcenter@gmail.com so you can join us. We have a Chabura of people already doing this. And join our Spiritual You Chabura and stay tuned for the next clip. We're going to get to really precise detail of how this works.